What did a silent white horse teach an entire town about love? A karmic fable. Have you ever looked into the eyes of a child at the moment they're abandoned, and wondered what hurts more, the fear of being alone in a deep forest, or the truth that the one who gave you life walked away without a word? One winter morning, in a grand estate hidden behind rows of old pine trees, twin boys Pedro and Juan woke up with innocent excitement. Outside, mist blanketed the stone pathways like a soft white veil. Birds chirped in the garden as usual, but inside the vast mansion, silence had long since taken hold. The boys lived in a house full of riches, but devoid of the one thing that mattered most: love. Pedro, the older and more spirited one, leapt out of bed and poked his brother's cheek to wake him up. "Dad said he'd take us to the forest today, remember?" he said, eyes sparkling like he'd just stepped out of a fairy tale. Juan rubbed his eyes and nodded. They had never been hugged by their father, let alone gone anywhere with him, so even the promise of a small outing filled their hearts with hope. In the dining room, the long table was set with pristine white linen, but only 3 plates sat far apart, just like the emotional distance between them all. Roberto, their father, a renowned businessman, was already seated, eating in silence. His heart was stone, his eyes calculating. A hug, a warm gaze, these were signs of weakness to him, and he never entertained them. Next to him stood Maria, the aging housemaid with silver in her hair. Her eyes followed every movement of the boys, her heart aching. She had witnessed every corner of this house for over 20 years, and she knew, Roberto never did anything without reason. So why now, suddenly, was he taking the boys to the forest, something he had never shown interest in? She forced a smile as she helped them into matching green coats. "Hold each other's hands tightly, little angels," she whispered, brushing Juan's hair. But her heart screamed with unease. The night before, she had accidentally seen Roberto in his office, tearing apart the last remaining family photo. At 7 a.m., a sleek black car pulled up to the front gate. Roberto stepped out, adjusting his suit collar as if heading to a boardroom, not an outing with his sons. He called out coldly, "Get in." Pedro tugged Juan's hand and ran toward the car, still unaware something was off. Juan, however, hesitated. He looked back at Maria, as if to ask, "Is something wrong?" But she could only swallow her tears and nod gently, waving as if everything were fine. The car door slammed shut, silencing the quiet cries of a woman who had watched these children grow day by day. The car sped off down the stone road, leaving behind the only place they had ever called home, even if it was a cold one. On the way, Pedro and Juan couldn't contain their excitement. They imagined rabbits hopping, birds nesting, and the special gift their father had promised. But their father said nothing, eyes glued to his watch, tapping each minute like a man racing toward a moral deadline. The scenery changed. Cornfields gave way to dense, foggy woods. The road narrowed, and mud clung to the tires. Pedro felt a twinge in his chest. Something wasn't right. He held Juan's hand tightly. Then, Juan asked softly, as if in a trance, "Dad, are we staying long?" Roberto glanced at them through the rearview mirror, a cold look devoid of fatherly warmth. No one knew it would be the last time the boys ever asked him a question. When the car stopped in a clearing, sunlight filtered dimly through the leaves. The air was chillingly still. Roberto stepped out, opened the rear door, and motioned silently for the boys to get out. "Wait here. I'll go get the gift." Pedro and Juan stood bewildered in the clearing, still holding hands. They didn't hear footsteps. Only the sound of the car reversing and the engine fading into the eerie silence. The wind rustled dry leaves. A bird flapped away, startled by a sin without a name. And the two children stood frozen, unaware that they had just been abandoned by their father. In a forest. In a world where the only love left would not come from humans. Have you ever seen an angel abandoned by life? If so, you'd know a child's heart breaking makes less sound than a single cry. The wind grew colder. Pedro squeezed Juan's hand tighter. They stood still in the clearing, as if staying put long enough would make everything go back to normal. That their father would return with some magical gift. Maybe a puppy. Or the toy car Pedro had always dreamed of. But every second that passed brought only the whisper of wind through trees and the pounding of their anxious hearts. Juan looked down at his soaked canvas shoes and muttered, "Dad's taking too long." Pedro didn't answer. Something was breaking inside him, but not enough to name. He looked around the gloomy forest, silently counting Juan's breaths as if as long as his brother was with him, things would be okay. But when he turned toward the dirt path where the car had vanished, all he saw was a thin curtain of dust, still lingering his father's final trace. "Pedro, do you think he'll come back?" Juan's voice trembled, lips turning blue from cold. Pedro wanted to say yes. But no sound came. He just nodded, then pulled Juan into a hug. Feeling his brother shiver like a leaf torn by the wind crushed Pedro's heart. He had to do something. He was the older one by just a few minutes, but now he had to be the protector. "Let's go, we need to find shelter before dark." Pedro took Juan's hand and headed toward a faint patch of light between the trees. He'd never been in a forest, but instinct told him standing in the open was foolish. The forest could devour the weak not with beasts, but with fear. Within a few steps, the tall brush swallowed their small bodies. Leaves crunched under bare feet. Branches scratched their faces, leaving red marks, but Pedro didn't stop. His brother needed him. That was the only thing he knew for sure. Soon, Juan began to sob, not from pain, but from cold, hunger, and the terrifying unknown that clung to them like a damp, moldy blanket. Just then, a strange sound echoed hoofbeats. Steady. Real. Pedro froze. A white shape emerged from the mist, a horse. But not like the ones in books. This one was tall, pristine, with snow-white fur untouched by dirt, and eyes that weren't animal eyes. They were eyes that understood. Juan stopped crying, mouth agape. The horse stood several meters away, unmoving. Watching. And Pedro felt something wrap around his heart, something warm and kind. They stared at the creature, fear melting into wonder. Then the horse bowed its head and walked toward a thick bush, pushing branches aside with its muzzle. Pedro followed, tugging Juan along. Behind the leaves was a bush of wild berries, dark purple and glistening. "Juan, look, fruit!" Pedro exclaimed. They knelt, picking the berries like they'd found a miracle. Juan ate slowly, savoring each bite. Pedro glanced up. Often the horse still stood nearby, eyes on them, like a silent guardian. "Thank you," Pedro whispered. He didn't know if it understood, but it nodded gently, a nod soft and compassionate, like moonlight through trees. The wind shifted. Gray clouds crawled above. Pedro pulled Juan close and tried to shield him with his coat. Life felt as fragile as a candle in a storm. Then the horse approached. It lay down just an arm's reach from them. Its gaze steady. Pedro hesitated, then inched forward, pulling Juan with him. The horse's breath was warm. Its scent reminded Pedro of being held by his mother after nightmares. "Can we sleep here?" Juan whispered. Pedro nodded. They curled up in the space between the horse's belly and front legs. It didn't move. It lay still, cradling the small bodies like a mother would. Night fell over the forest. The wind howled. Insects sang. The moon faded behind clouds. But in the darkness, 3 beings, 2 children and 1 animal lay together in a sacred harmony. No words were spoken. Yet something profound had begun. And somewhere, far from the forest, a mother jolted awake, heart hollow, overcome by a sense that the worst had happened. As night passed, the forest sank into eerie stillness. Only the wind whispered through the leaves like ancient lullabies. The moon hid behind thick clouds, but in a lonely corner of the woods, one place still glowed, not with fire, but with the warmth of 3 souls lying side by side. Pedro woke first. His back was still against the horse's body. Juan lay beside him, face buried in soft fur, breathing evenly. Pedro didn't dare move, afraid to wake him. The night before, Juan had cried in his sleep, mumbling "Mom" over and over. Pedro looked up. For the first time, he noticed the sky here was unlike the city. No lights, no horns. Just stars. But he wasn't in the mood to gaze. His mind overflowed with unanswered questions. Will Dad come back? Why did he leave us? Are we a burden? Nearby, the white horse Pedro had silently named it Neve was still awake. Its ears twitched at every forest sound. Occasionally, it lowered its head to sniff Juan gently, checking if he was okay. After a while, Pedro whispered, "Thank you, Neve, for not leaving us." The horse didn't reply, of course. But it nodded softly, blinking, offering a kind of love humanity had long forgotten, unconditional loyalty. Juan eventually stirred. He rubbed his eyes, looked up at Pedro in the faint moonlight. "We're still alive." Pedro smiled, a crooked, tired smile. "Yeah, because of Neve." Juan hugged the horse's neck and whispered like a prayer, "Mom, please find us." As the sun began to rise, light seeped into the forest, chasing away the mist. But that same light revealed the pain. The boys looked worn, faces smeared, clothes wrinkled, eyes sunken. Their stomachs growled, but neither spoke, not wanting to worry the other. Neve stood tall, a giant shadow of strength. It looked at them, then turned toward a hidden path. After a few steps, it paused and looked back, waiting. Pedro stood, pulling Juan up. "It wants us to follow." Juan nodded without hesitation. In a world where their father had left them, Neve was the only being they could trust. The walk wasn't long, but every step felt like leaving behind childhood. Every fallen leaf, every twisted tree rooted itself in Pedro's memory like fading dreams. He didn't know where they were going, but he wasn't alone. Eventually, the sound of trickling water emerged. A stream shimmered in sunlight ahead. Juan shouted, "Water! Look!" He ran to it, scooping handfuls, eyes wide with joy like finding magic again. Pedro drank carefully, then washed Juan's face. The cold water made their dirty faces glow anew. In that moment, they weren't abandoned children. They were tiny warriors, survivors of a brutal first night. They sat beside the stream. Neve stood nearby, silent like a stone deity. Pedro stroked its mane, gazing at the sun breaking through the trees. And for the first time since being left behind, he didn't feel angry at his father. Not because he had forgiven him, but because the anger was gone. In its place was something deeper: sorrow. Not for himself, but for the man who had chosen to abandon 2 innocent souls, trading them for a life of power without heart. Pedro didn't know that far from the forest, his father Roberto Mendoza had just awakened from a sleepless night, eyes hollow, sitting beside an empty bottle. And inside him, something had died with that morning too, the false peace he once mistook for strength. Elsewhere, in a damp little room in a nearby town, Clara, the mother of Pedro and Juan, was banging on Maria's door in tears. "Please. I feel something happened to my boys. I saw the forest in a dream, they were cold, and hungry." Maria opened the door, stunned to see the woman who had once been thrown out now trembling, begging for truth. And she, the silent woman of the house, decided for the first time in her life, to break the silence. The sun had climbed high. Golden rays pierced through the forest canopy, casting streaks of light across the damp, mossy ground. Pedro and Juan had temporarily filled their stomachs with a modest breakfast by the stream, but uncertainty still lingered in their eyes. They didn't know where to go, whether they should leave the forest or keep following the mysterious white horse. Nieve, as Pedro had silently named it, didn't wander off, nor did it stop watching them. Like a silent guardian, it kept an unspoken promise. The wind whistled through the leaves. Animal calls echoed from afar, all unfamiliar sounds for two children who had never left their luxurious estate. But suddenly, a different sound arose, stranger than birds or water, the rhythmic tapping of a wooden stick on stone. Someone was approaching. Pedro pulled Juan behind a bush, eyes wide with alertness. Through the trees, he spotted a figure, a lean but strong old man, wearing a straw hat, holding a walking stick, with a canvas sack slung over one shoulder. He paused, inspected some footprints on the ground, then looked around as if searching for someone. Nieve stirred. The horse stepped forward and let out a soft neigh, gentle, almost like a distant greeting. The old man straightened up, saw the white horse approaching, and laughed out loud. "Ah, so there you are, you stubborn creature." It was Nieve's owner. None other than Joaquin, a farmer who lived on the edge of the forest. Though old, he still tended his land and loved this horse like a lifelong friend. But before he could stroke Nieve's mane, he froze. Beneath the bush, two small children huddled, staring at him with wide, fearful eyes. Joaquin, who had seen all sorts of people in his life, stood still, not out of fear, but from emotion. The children, dirty, in torn clothes, faces smeared with soil. Yet their eyes filled with confusion, pain, and the faintest flicker of hope squeezed his heart. He didn't move closer right away. Instead, he sat down at the base of a nearby tree, lowering himself to their eye level. His voice was soft, like a breeze. "Don't be afraid. I'm a friend of Nieve's. He brought me here." Juan tightened his grip on Pedro's hand and hid behind his brother. Pedro remained standing, body trembling in confusion, but he could feel it, that man's gaze wasn't like his father's. It wasn't cold, condescending, or fake. It was warm. Like a fire on a winter morning. "Are you two lost?" Joaquin asked gently, though he didn't expect an answer. Everything was written on their faces: tear stains, scratches, purple bruises from cold and hunger. Fear. And the silent pain that has no words. Pedro whispered, almost inaudibly, "Dad, he went somewhere, and didn't come back." The words made Joaquin's heart clench. He'd seen many kinds of suffering in his life, but nothing compared to the pain of being abandoned by the one who gave you life. It wasn't a sharp, immediate pain like a wound, it was a slow, silent cut that bled inside forever. He unshouldered his canvas bag, pulled out 2 pieces of dry bread and a bottle of water. "Eat something. You must be starving." Pedro took the bread. His hand trembled as he handed a piece to his brother, not from hunger, but from the strange feeling swelling in his chest. Someone was caring for them. Juan ate while crying. Joachim stood, walked over to Neve, and placed a hand on the horse's neck. "Well done, old friend. You did what we grown-ups have forgotten how to keep a promise to protect the weakest." Then he turned to Pedro. "My name's Joachim. I live nearby. If you want, I can take you both home, give you a warm meal, a bath, and we'll go from there. No one will force you to do anything you don't want." Pedro looked at Juan, seeking his permission, then back at Joachim. He nodded softly. On the dirt path leading to Joachim's modest home hidden in the forest, the boys walked through a different world. Sunlight filtered through the trees like golden ribbons falling onto their hair. With each step away from the place they were left behind, it felt like waking from a long nightmare and stepping into a new reality where a horse and an old man, unrelated by blood, offered something far greater: compassion. The winding path toward Joachim's valley home seemed endless. Pedro and Juan walked in silence, their small hands still tightly clasped, afraid of losing one another. But unlike the walk they had taken behind their father that dreadful morning, each step now brought peace, not betrayal, but a kind of kindness they had never fully known. A red-tiled roof emerged behind a weathered wooden fence. In the yard grew lush vegetables, a few chickens clucked freely, and at the back stood a simple horse stable, Neve's nightly home. Pedro looked up, his eyes lingering on a clothesline fluttering in the wind. He had never seen a place so alive. Not because of electricity or fancy meals, but because every corner of this home breathed humanity. "We're home," Joachim called as he stepped into the yard. A woman's voice replied from inside, "Thank heavens you found Neve." "But, who are they?" She appeared in the doorway, a plump woman with neatly tied white hair, sharp eyes, and a warm presence. It was Dona Sifa, the housekeeper and cook who had looked after Joachim's home for over 20 years. She froze at the sight of the two ragged children, said nothing, and turned quickly inside. Pedro gripped Juan's hand tighter, fearing they'd be sent away. But minutes later, the smell of chicken stew wafted across the yard. Dona Sifa returned, holding two large towels and a pair of old clothes that once belonged to her grandchildren. "Go bathe. Wash that dirt off, then come eat. Kids who stay dirty in weather like this only catch colds," she said curtly. But her eyes betrayed the worry she tried to hide. In the bathroom, Pedro helped Juan wash his hair, clean his body, and change. He wondered how long had it been since anyone had touched them with genuine care? Every scratch, every bit of dirt under their nails seemed to wash away not just grime, but the lonely darkness they carried from that cold, silent mansion. When they came out, Juan smelled the chicken soup and fresh bread. His eyes lit up like he was seeing a miracle. They sat down to eat, not speaking much, only chewing slowly, savoring the warmth melting down their throats. Joachim sat on the porch, quietly watching the boys with a gaze full of weight. He had lost his wife in an accident and lived decades in solitude. But not even in his loneliest winters had his heart sunk as it did when he saw Pedro's eyes at the forest edge that morning. He didn't ask more. Not yet. He knew the truth sometimes needed time to come into the light. When Pedro finished and politely set down his spoon, he looked up and gently asked, Can my brother and I stay here, just for one night?" Joachim nodded without hesitation. "As long as you want. This is your home now, for as long as you need it to be." Juan jumped forward and hugged Pedro. He didn't say a word, just buried his face in his brother's shoulder, eyes shimmering. For the first time since that terrifying morning, Juan smiled. A real smile, not to reassure, not to hide tears, but because he felt safe. That night, Joaquim laid out a small bed in the living room. Dona Sifa added a soft yellow night lamp. She even placed 2 old teddy bears by their pillows, as if to say, "There's no shortage of love here." Pedro whispered, "Do you think this is Neve's home?" Juan nodded. "Probably. And Joaquim's too. But now, it's ours as well." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. But inside the wooden house, the chill brought no fear. Neve stood by the window, looking in. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, like a beacon gently whispering, "Everything will be all right." Have you ever felt that when a mother's heart begins to sink, the sky itself begins to thunder? Clara stood frozen in the small town square, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, forgotten. Her eyes stared ahead, but she wasn't really seeing. Inside, her heart throbbed with an invisible, overwhelming dread. Each gust of wind across her chest seemed to whisper, "They're in danger, your boys." "Clara." Maria's shaky voice pulled her back to reality. In front of her stood the old housemaid, silver-haired, in a wrinkled cloak, eyes wet. They embraced without a word, like 2 rivers meeting in a silent grief not yet named. And then, in the damp kitchen where they had once shared quiet conversations and heavy sighs, Maria told her every word, every detail about that morning Roberto took the boys and vanished. About his ice-cold eyes, and the relentless anxiety that gnawed at her all afternoon without explanation. Maria even wept, recalling how Juan had clung to her skirt like a kitten, silently begging for something she could not give. He said he was taking them on a special trip. I suspected something. But I didn't stop him. I was afraid. Clara didn't blame her. She only grasped the woman's hand, trembling. You knew what kind of man he was. Why didn't you call me, or the police? Maria lowered her head. I thought, maybe he was trying to make amends in his own way. A foolish thought. And now, the consequence might be 2 children lost in a freezing forest where wild animals could show more mercy than some who call themselves parents. The next morning, Clara went straight to the town police station. She banged on the counter, voice trembling but firm, I'm here to report a missing persons case. My son's twins. 4 years old. Abandoned by their biological father. And I know he lied to cover it up. Lieutenant Mendez, a middle-aged man with graying hair, listened with suspicion. Ms. Clara, there's no clear evidence Mr. Roberto Mendoza harmed his children. He's the legal father. He has rights. He has the right to leave them in the woods. The right to vanish without a trace. The right to drive a mother insane, wondering whether her children are alive or dead. Clara shouted, slamming her fist on the old wooden desk. She had never yelled like that. But today, something had snapped. Mendez sat upright. He'd seen many cases, but rarely did a frail, exhausted woman burn with eyes so fierce. A sacred fire no protocol could extinguish. All right, he said slowly. I'll record your statement. But understand, without witnesses or concrete evidence, our hands are tied. The man has connections. Clara nodded. She wasn't naive. She knew her ex-husband Roberto Mendoza was a powerful businessman. He could buy silence with blank checks, twist the law. But there was one thing he could never buy, a mother's heart. Leaving the station, Clara went to the church where Father Antonio, the priest who had baptized Pedro and Juan, still lived among relics thick with dust. She told him everything from the dreams of her sons lost in the forest, to the crushing weight in her chest whenever she thought of the worst. Father Antonio held her hand, nodding without hesitation, "I will help. When sin outweighs law, the conscience must rise." That very night, he called an old friend, Elena, a prosecutor known for her integrity. A day later, Elena arrived to meet Clara and Maria. Together, they gathered everything: the timeline, Maria's witness account, hospital records proving Clara's maternity. And then, something unexpected came from the last person Clara thought capable. Maria, quiet for years, rummaged through an old drawer and pulled out a small notebook, Roberto's. During one cleaning, she had seen him jotting down a suspicious plan, referencing erasing traces and cleaning things up before the board meeting. She had quietly photographed several pages with her old phone just in case. When Elena saw those photos, her face went pale. My God, this is probable cause for a criminal case. In Clara's small, musty room, once filled only with memories, a legal storm was quietly brewing. And for the first time in years, Clara didn't feel alone. Far away, on Joaquim's farm, Pedro and Juan sat on the wooden floor by the fireplace, learning how to fold paper into doves. Dona Sifa sat nearby, sewing a small shirt while occasionally glancing at the children with deep affection. No one in that quiet little house knew that, outside, their mother was beginning a brutal battle to bring light back to her innocent children. That morning's sunrise was unlike any other on the farm. The sunlight wasn't soft, it was fierce and blinding, like a divine push from above. Joaquim woke up earlier than usual, not to feed the chickens, not to check the stables, but because he knew, the time had come. He could no longer remain on the sidelines. He stood in front of the old mirror in his room, hands trembling as he straightened a freshly ironed shirt, the kind he usually wore only to weddings or funerals. Today, it was for something more sacred, the truth. Out on the porch, Pedro and Juan were still asleep, heads leaning against one another on a wooden bench. Beside them stood Neve, silent as a white statue, but its deep eyes followed Joaquim with quiet awareness. He stroked the horse's neck and whispered, "Watch the house for me, old friend. I'm doing this for the boys." Dona Sifa was already up. She quietly packed him some bread, boiled eggs, and water. "You know, once you step forward, there's no turning back, right?" she said gently. Joaquim nodded. "I've lived nearly 75 years, Sifa. And I've never felt peace like I have since those boys came here. If I stay silent now, I'm no different from their father. I can't let them grow up thinking all adults are cruel." Her heart sank. She had seen too many people give up. Too many children become ghosts inside their own lives. But the old man before her, weathered hands, seasoned eyes, and a heart that burned like an ember, was doing what few in the town dared: stand up and fight, regardless of the system. Joaquim left just as the sun touched the horizon. He wheeled his old bicycle down the dirt road to town, his worn boots thudding against the red clay path. But today, each step, each turn of the pedal, carried the rhythm of a heart ringing the bells of justice. At the town police station, Lieutenant Mendez was reviewing a case file when he heard a knock at the door. He looked up and immediately stood when he saw Joaquim walk in. This man was a living symbol of integrity. Everyone in town knew that. "Mr. Joaquim, what brings you here so early?" Mendez asked, half curious, half respectful. Joaquim sat down, placed his hat on the table, and looked the officer straight in the eyes. "I'm here to report the abandonment of 2 children in the forest. I'm the one who found them. And I'm willing to testify in court." The air in the room went still. Mendez blinked, then opened his notebook and began writing. "Can you walk me through what happened?" For nearly an hour, Joaquim detailed everything: the hoof prints and small footprints in the woods, the children's terrified eyes, their scratches, hunger, the days spent at his farm, and most importantly Pedro's own words: "Dad said he was going to get a gift, but he never came back. My horse, Neve," he added, eyes glinting with emotion, "he's the one who found them. And I don't believe it was random. Something beyond reason guided him." Mendez set down his pen and leaned back. He knew that if it had only been Clara's word, it would have been difficult. But with Joaquin it was different. In this town, he was a moral pillar. No one had ever questioned his word. If he said it happened, it happened. "I'll forward this to Prosecutor Elena," Mendez said. "And if necessary, you're willing to testify?" Joaquim nodded firmly. "Until my last breath." Back at the farm, Pedro and Juan woke up and looked around for Joaquim, but he was nowhere in sight. At the window, Neve still stood, eyes focused on the horizon. Juan stroked his mane gently and asked, "Where did he go, Neve?" The horse neighed softly, as if responding in a language only pure hearts could understand. Pedro took his brother's hand and led him outside. The children didn't know it yet, but that morning, the battle for their future had reached a turning point. There are those who build thrones with deceit and money, thinking they can construct a lifetime on cemented lies. But what they forget is, when hearts begin to shift, even the strongest walls can collapse in a single night. At Prosecutor Elena's office, the air was thick, like the moment before a storm. She rested her hand on a stack of documents and looked directly at Lieutenant Mendez, who had just delivered Joaquim's statement. "Are you certain this testimony is accurate?" Elena asked, voice firm. Mendez nodded. "Absolutely. Joaquim is the kind of man that even if the whole world said one thing and he said another, I'd believe him." Elena didn't respond immediately. She knew this case wasn't just about criminal neglect. This was the needle that could pierce the glamorous veil Roberto Mendoza had spent years weaving. If mishandled, it could take down a dozen others, from local officials to business partners. She picked up her phone and called Clara. "You need to be ready. We're preparing to launch a formal investigation. But I need you, no matter who pressures you, not to back down." Clara responded with just one sentence, "I won't stop until my boys are named for what they truly are, victims, not burdens." Elena hung up and looked at the painting behind her desk, Lady Justice, blindfolded, holding the scales. But today, she thought, those eyes must open to see who the real victims are. At the Mendoza estate, Roberto was in a panic unlike anything he had ever known. His phone buzzed non-stop, calls and texts from board members, partners, even reporters, like a pack of wolves circling their prey. "You told us those children didn't exist," one investor yelled over the phone. "Now every local paper is leaking a story that you're being investigated for child abandonment. What the hell is going on?" Roberto tore off his tie and punched the wall. He never imagined things could spiral like this. All because of a stupid horse, a crazy old man, and a woman who refused to surrender. He called Marcos, his private attorney, demanding that he handle Clara and Joaquim. But on the other end, Marcos's tone had changed. "Roberto, I can't help you if you keep denying everything. They have the journal, the photos, a witness. And word is, the prosecutor is preparing a summons." "Damn it!" Roberto screamed. And damn it, indeed. Because the cracks were starting to show. Meanwhile, at the church, Father Antonio held a private meeting. There were no hymns, only whispered discussions among community members, people who had once known Roberto, who had once stayed silent. But they didn't want to be silent anymore. I used to see him yelling at the kids, locking them in a room when guests came over, one person said. I thought it was just discipline, but now I think it was imprisonment, another added. With their help, Elena began piecing together a long trail of abuse Roberto had tried to bury, silencing Clara with money, banning staff from mentioning the twins, hiding birth certificates. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became this wasn't negligence. It was a calculated erasure, planned long ago. Back at the farm, Joaquim received a handwritten letter, no return address. It read, "Stay away from the case if you don't want an accident." There was no signature. But he knew what it was, a threat. And even more clearly, he knew, he would not back down. "Someone's trying to scare you," Dona Sifa said, shaking. "Good," Joaquim replied, so calm it was chilling. "Because if they're scared, that means they know they'll soon be held accountable." Pedro and Juan didn't understand the battle happening around them. But they could feel it, Joaquim leaving earlier, coming home later. Their mother no longer calling to ask for permission to visit, only sending letters that read, "I'm getting closer, my loves." And Neve the white horse from the stories had begun sleeping on the porch every night, as if guarding something sacred. Have you ever seen an animal cornered, with no way out? In that moment, it doesn't plan or pretend, it claws, bites, does anything to survive. But there's one thing it cannot do, escape a trap it set for itself. Roberto Mendoza, once the man who made an entire town bow, was slowly becoming a prisoner in his own mansion. The same stone walls that once protected his reputation now felt like iron bars. His phone stopped ringing. His driver took family leave. Old employees pretended not to recognize him at the market. Even Marcos, his closest legal ally, began to keep his distance. "You're abandoning me," Roberto hissed through clenched teeth during a brief, tense meeting. Marcos set down his coffee cup untouched. "I practiced law for nearly 20 years, Roberto. I know when a ship is sinking. I'm not going down with it. What do you know? She's just a poor woman. He's an old stable hand. And those kids? Ungrateful brats. We can still flip this around." Marco smirked and stood up. "Sometimes, it's the people you dismiss the most who take everything from you. I hope you realize that before it's too late." The cafe door slammed shut, leaving Roberto in a panic he could no longer mask. The storm cloud had settled overhead, and this time, there was no umbrella big enough to shield him. At the same time, in Prosecutor Elena's office, an emergency meeting was underway. The evidence provided by Clara, Joaquim, and Maria was enough to request an official summons for investigation. They didn't rush to arrest because Elena knew, to strike the final blow, they needed to bring every missing piece into the light. "We have the journal outlining the plan to erase the children, a witness confirming the abandonment, and someone who's been threatened," Elena said, voice steady. "But what I need now is the clincher, a piece of undeniable proof tied to financial motive." Maria hesitated, then slowly pulled a photocopied document from her bag, one she had secretly taken while cleaning Roberto's office. "I remember he hid the original in a safe, but I kept a copy. It's a contract with a foreign partner. Check the final clause about ethics. If exposed, the deal gets voided." Elena flipped to the last page. "Just as suspected. El contratante deberá tener ningún escándalo público o familiar que comprometa la imagen de la empresa. The contracting party must not be involved in any public or family scandal that may damage the company's image. So that's why he was willing to throw away his own children. Mendez muttered, unable to hide his anger. No. Not willing. He already did, Elena corrected, her voice like ice. Meanwhile, Clara was standing in a very different place. In front of the cold iron gates of the Mendoza estate, the same place she had once been thrown out of in shame, years ago. Today, she returned. Not to beg, but to reclaim her dignity, her motherhood, and justice for Pedro and Juan. Her hair was wild in the wind, but her eyes burned bright, sharp as blades. And she wasn't alone. Beside her stood Father Antonio and a team of local journalists. Elena had given the green light for media to access the case because now, public opinion would become their weapon. Roberto stepped out from the mansion, face pale as he saw the cameras, microphones, and Clara's gaze, not that of a weak mother, but of a warrior forged in righteousness. "You know why I'm here?" she asked, each word carved like stone. Roberto swallowed hard, forcing a crooked smile. "You're here for money." "No," she replied, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm here so you can see what you'll never have, the true love of children for the mother who never left them in the forest." A reporter stepped forward. "Mr. Mendoza, do you have anything to say about the allegation of abandoning minors?" He backed away, saying nothing. The eyes that once radiated power were now filled with panic. He turned and slammed the gate. But the cameras kept rolling. And justice doesn't shut off as easily as an iron door. Back at the farm, Joaquim turned on the TV and saw Clara standing at the estate gates on the evening news. Pedro and Juan sat beside him in silence. When Pedro saw his mother, he leaned forward, eyes welling up. "She's fighting for us, isn't she, sir?" Joaquim placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded. "Yes. And nothing can stop a real mother." Neve neighed loudly, as if understanding that the final confrontation had begun. The morning of Judgment Day began with heavy rain. Not a passing shower but a long, pounding storm, like war drums echoing across the small town. Everyone could feel it, something big was coming. At the provincial courthouse, Prosecutor Elena, Lieutenant Mendez, and Clara's legal counsel were there early. On their table sat the full case file they had assembled over weeks, photocopies of Roberto's journal, Joaquim's testimony, the ethical clause in the multimillion-dollar contract, and Clara's official complaint. Everything was meticulously prepared to request an arrest warrant for Roberto Mendoza. But then, something unexpected happened. Roberto disappeared. When police arrived at the mansion to deliver the emergency summons, the gate was locked. The car was gone. The housekeeper had left the day before. He had vanished into the rain, leaving behind only a cold house and an empty office. "He ran," Elena said, her eyes darkening. "He knew we were closing in, so he took the oldest way out, escape." "But he can't have gone far," Mendez said firmly. "All roads are being checked. Traffic officers are inspecting every vehicle leaving town. He won't get away." Inside a black SUV parked in the outskirts, Roberto sat hunched over, hands shaking as he clutched his phone. He called Marcos but no answer. Called his trusted driver, disconnected. Every lifeline that once lifted him now retreated, like a tide pulling away from a giant who had built his kingdom on sand. He took long drags from a cigarette, eyes staring blankly through the rain-streaked glass, muttering, "You think you've won? I still have money. I still have power." But he was wrong. Power built on lies rots from the inside the moment truth strikes. Back at Joaquim's farm, Clara stood under the porch, staring into the blinding rain. Beside her, Pedro and Juan stood close, hands tightly clasped. their small eyes brimmed with questions. But today, they needed no answers. Because their mother's presence, warm, steady, unshakable, was the greatest answer of all. Outside, Neve neighed sharply, stomping as if sensing something wasn't right. Joachim stepped out from the barn, holding a raincoat and an old rifle, not to threaten, but as instinctual protection. He had lost everything once. Now he was holding something more valuable than gold, the trust of children. "Clara, I just got word Roberto's fled," he said. Clara closed her eyes for a moment. "I know." He never had the courage to face his son's eyes. Joachim nodded, then suddenly turned toward the end of the road. His eyes narrowed. "A car's coming." A black SUV emerged from the mist, moving slowly, headlights off. Inside was Roberto, eyes bloodshot, face pale from exhaustion and despair. He didn't even know what he was doing anymore. Perhaps, deep down, he just wanted to see his sons one last time. Or maybe, he was drawn by something people call the ashes of conscience. But he didn't realize that behind him, a police cruiser had been tailing closely. Roberto had forgotten to disable his phone's GPS. As the SUV neared the farm gate, Neve neighed loudly, stomping the ground. Pedro flinched. "Mom. It's him." Clara stepped in front of her children, shielding them with her body. Joachim stood behind her, hand resting on her shoulder. Police arrived at the same moment, red and blue lights flashing in the gray sky. Mendez and Elena stepped out of the car. "Roberto Mendoza. You are under arrest for abandoning minors, abuse of parental rights, and obstruction of justice," Mendez shouted, pulling out the cuffs. Roberto collapsed against the hood of the car. Rain poured over his face, mixing with tears. No one could tell if they were from fear, regret, or too late remorse. Pedro and Juan watched through the rain, hands gripping tightly. No one spoke. Only Clara, her voice trembling but firm, finally said the words she had carried for years. "You left them in the forest. But it was the horse you scorned that saved them. And the old man you ignored who taught them what it means to be kind." Roberto bowed his head. He had nothing left to fight with. That day, at the provincial courthouse, Roberto was formally detained. The media exploded. The internet erupted. A businessman once seated at the top was now the face of disgrace. And in a closed hearing, the most powerful moment wasn't from the prosecutor's indictment but from Pedro's short, heartfelt statement, spoken as he clutched the teddy bear that once slept beside Neve. "I don't need presents. I just want my parents to keep their promises. But Dad left. And Mom never did." The courtroom fell silent. A 4-year-old child didn't need to condemn anyone. His truth alone was enough to make the grown ups bow their heads. The iron gate of the courthouse slammed shut behind Roberto Mendoza with a dry clank like the final period on a dark chapter. The entire town exhaled. Those who once feared his power now lifted their heads, as if the sky had cleared after a long storm. But for Pedro and Juan, the truth didn't vanish just because their father was in handcuffs. Fear, abandonment, and unanswered questions still lived inside them, in their wide eyes, and in the dreams that would haunt them at night. And so, the real journey, the journey of healing, was only just beginning. After the hearing, Clara and her sons left the courthouse in silence. No one said a word. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still soaked, and the cold air crept beneath their coats. Pedro clung to his mother's hand, eyes fixed on his soggy shoes. Juan rested his head against her shoulder, searching for the one safe place that remained. Back at Joachim's farm, they were greeted with the warmest dinner Dona Sifa had ever made: hearty chicken and vegetable stew, crispy cornbread, and a pot of steaming hot chocolate, the boys' favorite since coming to this home. "This meal isn't to celebrate someone's arrest," Joaquim said gently, "but to give thanks that we still have each other." Clara quietly set her spoon down, her eyes red but not from grief. For the first time in years, she felt the complete warmth of a true home. In the days that followed, life began to find a new rhythm. But it wasn't easy. Pedro, the one who had seemed the strongest, turned out to be the most deeply hurt. He slept fitfully every night, often waking in the middle of the dark, clutching his blanket and mumbling, "Mom, don't go, don't leave me." Clara would hold him tight and whisper, "I'm here, always here." Juan, on the other hand, didn't say much. He buried himself in paper and crayons. All day long, he drew drawings of a house, of grassy fields, of Joaquim, Dona Sifa, of his mom, and of Neve. In every drawing, the white horse stood at the center, like a silent guardian angel. One evening, as the sunset bathed the golden fields in honey light, Juan tugged Joaquim's sleeve and hesitantly asked, "Grandpa, can Neve sleep in my room tonight?" The old man chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Neve's a horse. He's used to sleeping under the porch. But if you want, I'll move your bed next to the window tomorrow, so you can see him in the morning." Juan nodded. "I just want to see him, every morning." Because to him, seeing Neve first thing after waking up was proof that the nightmare had passed. A week later, Clara received word from Prosecutor Elena. The court had officially granted her full custody, ordered Roberto to pay child support, and forbade any contact until the children turned 18 and could decide for themselves. In addition, a scholarship fund had been established from Roberto's frozen assets reserved solely for Pedro and Juan. Clara said nothing after reading the news. She simply placed her hand gently on the heads of her sleeping sons. In the soft sunlight filtering through the curtains, she whispered, "From today on, you are free children." In town, the story of Neve spread everywhere. A local TV reporter visited the farm to interview the family and recorded a clip of Pedro describing how the horse had shown them where to find water, fruit, and had lain down so they could sleep beside him. The video went viral, moving thousands to tears. Many began calling Neve El Angel Blanco, the white angel, a symbol of salvation in the form of a horse. One animal rights organization even offered to fund the construction of a new stable for Joaquim so Neve could live like the legend he is. But Joaquim only laughed and waved it off. "No need. The kids calling him friend is more than enough." On a clear morning, Juan brought out a special drawing to show his mother and Joaquim. It was a picture of a large house with a chimney, flower gardens, chickens pecking at grain, Neve standing in the middle of the yard, and the whole family sitting around a dinner table. Clara was speechless. Pedro gently taped the drawing to the wall. "This is our house. Our real home." And in that moment, for the first time in their lives, two once abandoned children finally knew what it felt like to belong. Some letters never need to be mailed, because the recipient is always near. They live in each heartbeat, each breeze, each unforgotten memory. It's the kind of letter a 4-year-old might write, with wobbly handwriting and an open heart. A letter to a horse. That morning, before the sun crested the hill, Pedro sat alone at the old porch table, gently chewing the end of a blue crayon. He had spent all morning drawing, but not a house, or trees, or Joaquim. This time, he was writing. On the paper in front of him were crooked, slanted letters, but each one echoed something deep and true. "Dear Neve. I remember when you let us sleep beside your belly. It was so warm. Thank you for not leaving us. We'll never leave you. We love you very much. Pedro and Juan. At the bottom, he had drawn a small white horse with two children curled up beside it. The moonlight draped over them like a giant blanket. And in the corner, Pedro drew a purple heart. He folded the paper, tied it carefully around the neck of a ragged, one-eared teddy bear, the same one he had clung to when left in the woods, the only remnant of his old world. He carried it out to the stable and held it out to Neve. Keep it safe, okay? Don't rip it, he whispered. Neve bent his head, gently sniffed the paper, then rubbed his nose against Pedro's cheek as if nodding in understanding. No one had ever taught Neve how to be a hero. But he never needed a lesson. He lived by instinct shaped by loyalty, and a kind of sensing only animals truly understand. That afternoon, Clara walked into the yard carrying a small backpack. Inside were simple food, water, a thin towel and an old photo, two newborn babies wrapped in white wool blankets. Back then, Roberto hadn't yet become a monster. And she was still a small town girl who believed love could change everything. Where are we going, Mom? Juan asked, still holding his crayons. We're going back to where you were once left behind, Clara replied slowly. But this time, to say goodbye. Pedro looked up. Goodbye, to the sadness. Clara paused. She had never expected her son to phrase it that way. But he was right. They weren't going to cry or to blame but to let go. The three of them, along with Joaquim and Neve, made their way back to the forest. Almost nothing had changed, the same red dirt road, the rustling trees, and the thick carpet of fallen leaves. But their eyes, those had changed. Pedro walked cautiously, scanning around as if searching for the shadow of his past self. Juan held Clara's hand the entire time, but instead of fear, he kept asking, is this where I saw the berries? Was this where Neve neighed? When they reached the clearing where Roberto had once abandoned his sons, Clara stopped. She looked around. There were no more cries. No more numbness. Just wind whispering through the trees and sunlight filtering down like a silent blessing. Clara pulled the old photo from her bag and buried it beneath a tree, covering it with small stones. We don't need to keep pain under our pillows or on our walls anymore. It can rest here as part of the past. Pedro and Juan didn't speak. They sat beside her and quietly placed a stone each on the grave of memory. Neve stood behind them, unmoving, as if standing guard over something sacred. As the sun began to sink westward, Clara turned to her sons. Do you forgive your father? Pedro bowed his head, silent. Juan murmured, I don't know. Clara nodded, stroking their hair. You don't have to know yet. Forgiveness comes from the heart. But don't let hatred shrink yours. She turned to Joaquim. Thank you, for never walking away from us. The old man didn't reply. He just gently tugged Neve's reins, and the horse stepped forward to lead the way home. Their return to the forest wasn't just a visit. It was a ritual, a cleansing journey. There were no monks, no prayers. Just the heart of a mother, two children, and a white horse standing in nature as if nature itself had once assigned him the task of guarding two fragile souls. Pedro looked back one last time at the trees fading behind them and whispered. That place, it's where I was almost lost. But it's also where I was found. The new apartment sat on the edge of town, near a school, library, and park. It was granted to Clara and her sons through support from the local government and community, after the ordeal. It wasn't fancy. No expensive furniture. But every wall had been painted by loving hands, neighbors, friends, and strangers who had once cried reading the story of the boys abandoned in the woods. On moving day, the sky was gently sunny. There were no ribbons. No welcome party. Just Pedro holding a small flower pot. Juan carrying his box of crayons. And Clara stepping through the door, her eyes glowing with something rare, the light of a woman who had lost everything, and now was beginning again. That afternoon, sunlight spilled across the floor when Pedro ran into the living room, voice full of joy. Grandpa Joaquim finished the sign, Mom. Clara turned from hanging the curtains. What sign, sweetie? He held up a little wooden board, the letters carved in rough handwriting. The house of Pedro, Juan, and Mama Clara. And friend Neve on weekends. Juan burst out laughing and ran off to find a nail to hang it. Clara didn't laugh. She stood still for a moment. Because to her, that sign wasn't just a label for a home, it was a vow. A vow that here, no one would ever be left behind again. No one would silently suffer. No one would be treated like a secret to be hidden. That night, their first in the new apartment, Clara laid out an old cloth, the only item she had kept from her days in Roberto's house. She set out 3 plastic plates, a small pot of rice, and homemade vegetable soup. There was no feast. Just a simple dinner eaten in peace. As Juan served rice into her bowl, he looked up and asked, Mom, are we poor? Clara smiled, brushing his hair back. No, we're not poor. We just don't have a lot of money. But we have more than enough love. Pedro nodded thoughtfully. So that means, we're rich in a different way. But trauma doesn't disappear just because you change houses. That night, Juan had a nightmare again. He screamed, drenched in sweat, eyes wide with terror. No. Don't leave us again. Don't leave us in the forest. Clara bolted upright, cradling her son in her arms. Her tears soaked his hair, one drop at a time. No one's leaving you, my love. I'm here. I'll always be here, she whispered like a lullaby. The next morning, Juan didn't mention the dream. But when he woke, he brought out a new drawing. 3 people standing side by side, a house over them, and one single word written in bold red crayon. Forever. In the weeks that followed, Clara found work at the town library organizing books, reading stories to children, and managing the kids' reading corner. With every new book she touched, she saw a glimpse of her younger self, the poor girl who loved reading and believed in the kindness of the world. One day, Father Antonio stopped by the library and handed her a small box. Someone asked me to give this to you. Anonymous. Doesn't matter who. Just open it. Inside was a handwritten note and a simple silver necklace. This isn't to make amends. Because some mistakes can't be undone. I just hope you know, someone out there, even late, finally understood how deeply wrong they were. No signature. But Clara knew. And she placed the necklace back into the box, not wearing it. Because forgiveness, if it ever came, would not be hers to give. It would have to come from her sons. On weekends, Pedro and Juan returned to the farm to visit Joaquim and Neve. The little house nestled in green fields was no longer a place of refuge, it was homecoming. A reminder that though the world can be cruel, there are still warm places in the hearts of good people. That day, Joaquim sat under a tree weaving a new wooden chair. Pedro ran up to him excitedly. I learned how to plant seeds at school. I'm gonna plant flowers around the house for Neve to smell when he visits. Juan added, "and I'll draw lots of pictures of Neve and hang them all over our new home." Joaquim nodded, smiling at the boys dancing around him. "You're learning how to love the right way, not with presents or big words, but by planting." That night, as they returned to the apartment, Pedro hugged his mother tightly and whispered, "Mom, I'm not scared anymore. Because now, even if someone leaves me, I know how to find my way home." Clara embraced her son, tears rolling down her cheeks, not of sorrow, but of someone who knows that love has finally found its way back. No one expected the video of Pedro, Juan, and the white horse Neve, originally filmed for a local news segment, to go viral. People around the world shared the clip of the boy describing their night in the forest, of the white horse lying still so two children could sleep beside him. It felt like a real miracle in the middle of ordinary life. Within just 3 days, the video had over 2 million views translated into multiple languages, with a caption that pierced hearts around the world. "The horse didn't leave us. But the adults did." Back at their small apartment, things remained as simple as ever, except now, their mailbox overflowed with handwritten letters, postcards, and small gifts from all over the world. There was a letter from a single mother in Argentina, once forced to give up her child because of poverty. An email from a former prisoner in Korea, who confessed he cried all night after watching the video and wrote, "Sometimes all it takes to save someone is a white horse." There were even letters from children, written in clumsy handwriting. "I don't have a dad, but I have a mom and a cat. Like you guys." Clara read every line, tears falling quietly where the boys couldn't see. "These words, they're not really for me," she told Joaquim over the phone. "They're writing to the boys, not knowing they're the ones doing the healing." One Saturday morning, while Clara was cleaning the kitchen, there was a knock on the door. Juan ran to open it. Standing there was a middle-aged man in a black coat, holding a bouquet of white daisies and a notebook. "Are you Juan?" he asked, voice trembling. Juan nodded, looking at the stranger curiously. "Who are you?" "I'm someone who watched your video. And I needed to say thank you." Clara stepped out, eyes cautious. "I'm sorry," the man quickly added, holding out the notebook. "I don't want anything. I just wanted to leave this behind. As a way to make up for something I never did." Clara opened it. Inside were handwritten pages, dense and raw confessions, regrets, memories of missed chances to hug his son, the one time the boy had asked, "Do you love me, Dad?" and the man hadn't answered. "That boy is grown now, and doesn't call me Dad anymore," the man whispered. "But when I heard Pedro say, 'Dad left us, but Neve didn't,' I knew I had to do something. Not to be forgiven. Just to let someone else know, they're not alone." Clara stood frozen. Pedro stepped forward from behind, holding a homemade cookie, and offered it up. "Are you sad? Then eat this. Mom says sweet things help sadness go away." The man took it, his hands shaking. He bowed deeply, placed the bouquet of daisies on the doorstep, and walked away in silence. That night, Juan whispered to his mom, "Mom, why do some people cry when they look at me?" Clara smiled, brushing his hair. "Because you remind them that no matter what they've done, there's still a chance to begin again. So I can help people, just by living." Clara nodded. "Yes. Sometimes, just by standing tall after everything, you become a light for others." Back at the farm, Joaquim received a letter from a school in the distant north. They wanted to invite him and Neve to visit and speak to students about loyalty and courage. He laughed and said to Neve, "Well, look at that. You can't read, can't speak, and now you're a teacher." Neve neighed loudly, as if laughing with him. In the following weeks, Clara and her sons began visiting schools, libraries, and orphanages, not to tell a sad story, but to share the miracle that one can survive trauma and live beautifully. At every stop, Pedro carried a small jar of seeds. He scattered them in playgrounds, along walls, and in flower beds. "We're planting flowers," Juan explained, "so when we come back, we'll know something good once happened there." 3 months after Pedro and Juan moved into their new apartment, the quiet town buzzed with special news. The city council had decided to build a small memorial in the forest where the boys were once abandoned. Not to reopen wounds, but to honor their extraordinary survival, the loyalty of a horse, and the rebirth of a family. That morning, the sky was clear, the breeze soft. The whole town seemed to wake earlier than usual. People carried flowers, held their children's hands, and walked toward the edge of the forest where the once dirt path had been paved with stones and lined with wildflowers. Joaquim led the crowd, holding Neve's reins. The white horse was freshly groomed, a simple red ribbon tied around his neck. Behind them walked Pedro and Juan, each carrying a small bouquet of white daisies. Clara came last. No makeup. No fancy clothes. Just a faded shirt, the one stained with tears from the days her children were missing. She kept it now as a talisman. At the forest clearing, everyone fell silent when they saw what had been waiting there. A simple white stone statue of a bowed horse, 2 children resting their heads against its body, and an inscription above. Here, a horse who couldn't speak taught an entire town how to love again. No one could hold back their tears. The mayor invited Pedro to step forward. He looked nervous, but took his brother's hand and walked up to the statue. Wind tousled their hair. Neve stood behind them, letting out a soft neigh, as if offering comfort. Pedro pulled from his pocket a crumpled old note, the letter he once wrote to Neve. He slid it into a small slot beneath the statue and whispered, "This is your new home, Neve. Not a stable, but the heart of everyone." Juan pulled out a drawing from his backpack, the very first he had colored after being rescued, 2 children, a horse, and the moon. He laid it beside the flowers. No speeches. No ribbon cutting. The presence of the 2 boys said everything that needed to be said. After the ceremony, a little girl around 7 approached Juan, eyes red from crying. "You're Juan, right?" Juan nodded. "I was left behind too, at my grandma's. My mom didn't want me anymore," she whispered. Pedro stepped in, said nothing, and pulled out one of his flower seeds, something he always carried. He placed it in her hand. "Then let's plant a flower. So someday, where you're standing, there'll be blossoms like the place I was once left behind." The girl burst into tears and hugged Pedro. And in that moment, everyone understood. Today wasn't just the unveiling of a statue. It was the lighting of a fire. At the end of the ceremony, Father Antonio turned to Joaquim and softly said, "You didn't just save 2 children. You saved this community's faith." Joaquim chuckled, patting Neve's back. "I only did what my heart told me to do. The real hero is the one standing here, chewing grass." Everyone laughed through tears. That night, back at the apartment, Clara opened an old folder and pulled out the photo of Pedro and Juan on the day they were born. She didn't cry this time. Instead, she wrote on the back, "We were once lost in the forest, but we found the light again. I love you, always." Clara, on the day the forest was called home. Outside the window, the moonlight poured in just like it once had. But this time, it wasn't to illuminate fear. It was to mark a new beginning. In the damp rooms of a distant correctional facility, Roberto Mendoza lived like a shadow. No more expensive suits. No more phones ringing with million-dollar deals. No more powerful name. Just a lonely man known only by one number, 4237. Since the day of his sentencing, he barely spoke. Accepted no letters. Answered no media. But deep beneath the cold, quiet shell, something stirred. The day he received a small envelope. No postmark. No sender. Only two crooked letters on the back. Pedro. Roberto stared at the name. His hands trembled. He had been staring at the envelope all morning, as if it were a ticking bomb. Finally, he opened it. Inside was a small yellow sheet school paper. The handwriting was uneven, a child's scrawl. But each word struck straight to the heart. I'm Pedro. I don't hate you anymore. I don't understand why you did what you did, but Mom says sometimes grown ups do bad things because they haven't learned how to love yet. Juan and I are doing well. We plant flowers, draw pictures, and have lots of friends. I just wanted you to know we still remember you. Not the version that scared us, but the one who once promised to take us to the forest. I hope that one day, if you've learned how to love, we can meet again. Not to blame you, but to see if you have any flowers to show us. That was all. No accusations. No I hate you. Just the voice of a child's heart wounded, but still hopeful. Roberto folded the letter. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. But for the first time, his chest felt hollow. Not from loss, but because something had entered and lit a spark. That night in prison, Roberto couldn't sleep. He stared at the cracked ceiling and thought about what he had truly lost. Not just reputation. Not just money. But two children who once lay in his arms, newborn and blinking at him like he was their entire world. He had crushed that world. With ambition, pride, and fear that acknowledging them publicly would cost him everything. He had never learned how to love. Because no one had ever taught him that love means keeping, not hiding. The next day, he asked the guard for paper and a pen. For the first time in months, he wrote a letter. Not to a lawyer. Not to shareholders. But to Pedro. My son. I don't expect forgiveness. I haven't earned it. But when I read your letter, I felt myself shrink. Smaller than a grain of sand in the palm of your hand. I used to think I was strong. That I could control everything. But it turns out, the strongest one is a child who forgives the man who left him. I don't know when you'll be ready to see me. But today, I planted a flower seed beside the prison yard. And if it blooms, I'll know. My heart still has good soil. Dad, Roberto. At the little apartment, when Pedro received the letter from the correctional center, he didn't open it right away. He handed it to his mom, eyes asking what to do. Clara read it silently, folded it back, and gave it to Pedro. This is your choice, she said gently. I won't interfere. But I believe, you're old enough to decide how you want to love or not love someone. Pedro opened it. Read it. Said nothing. Then he stepped onto the balcony, where the flower pots were just beginning to bud. He planted a flower, Mom. He whispered, eyes looking toward the sky. Clara joined him, wrapped an arm around his shoulder. Then now, we wait to see if that heart will bloom. There's something strange about life. Sometimes it's the children who first open the door for grown ups to begin healing. After Pedro read Roberto's letter aloud during a community gathering at the town library, something unexpected happened. Not anger, not shame, but applause. A long, quiet, tearful applause. No one had expected the boy who was abandoned to be the first to offer forgiveness. From that day forward, Clara's home became a place where the lost quietly came to find their way back. There was Mr. Luis, 68, estranged from his daughter for years because she became a single mother. He came with a bag of cookies, whispering to Clara. When Pedro said, "We don't need a perfect dad, just one who's honest," I realized how wrong I'd been. I don't want much. Just one night, sitting beside my daughter, hearing her laugh again. Then came Ms. Marissa, a retired teacher, who burst into tears as she watched Juan draw the forest no longer scary, now gentle under the moonlight. I once made my younger sister give up her baby for the family's reputation. That child is grown now, but I haven't dared to see her again. Pedro gently tugged her hand and whispered, "Maybe if you give her a plant, she'll understand." And then there was a quiet stranger sitting at the edge of the farm on a warm, breezy afternoon. Gray shirt, old cap in hand. Joaquim recognized him instantly. An old friend of Roberto's. A man who once denied a child born outside marriage. No one blamed him. Only Pedro stepped forward, and handed him a drawing. A small bird, flying out of a cage. "You can hang this on your wall," Pedro said. "To remember, anyone can leave the cage they built for themselves." The man wept his first tears in decades. On the last evening, as sunset kissed the red-tiled roof of Joaquim's farm, the whole community gathered on the grass. The same place Pedro and Juan had their birthday celebration the year before. They didn't come to celebrate. They came to listen. Not to fairy tales, but to a true story. Of a forest. Of darkness. Of a speechless horse that shielded two small souls. And the miracle of choosing forgiveness over resentment. Pedro stood on a wooden crate, holding up his old notebook. On the cover, scrawled in childlike writing, "We've learned that loving means not holding on to darkness." Juan clutched a bouquet of white daisies, the ones he'd picked from the forest, and spoke, softly but firmly. "We're not good at speeches. But if anyone here ever felt afraid they couldn't be loved, we want to invite you to our home. We have Mama Clara, Grandpa Joaquim, Auntie Sifa, and Neve too. You can eat soup with us. And if you want, plant a seed." Everyone stood. There was no roaring applause. Only tears in their eyes. And soft footsteps drawing closer. A human circle formed. In the center, Juan handed each person a small seed wrapped in folded paper. Everyone accepted one. Even those who had once said, "My heart is too hard." Joaquim stood nearby, leaning on his cane, watching Neve graze peacefully. He whispered, "We didn't save the whole world, old friend. But we saved a piece of it. And that piece is spreading." That night, Clara held her sons close, as if they were still 4 years old, lost in the woods. But this time, her dreams were not of forests, not of abandonment, only of their laughter, and the sound of distant hoofbeats, steady as a promise. Thank you for joining us. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share. What did this story teach you? How might it shape the way you live or forgive? Your voice matters. Reading your reflections brings strength, healing, and inspiration to us all. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us create more stories that awaken the soul. Thank you for watching. And we'll see you in the next video.